Welcome to memoQ Talks, where we talk to industry leaders about their experiences, lessons learned, and what works best across all areas of localization. Now here's your host.
I am super excited. This is the first time for me to have 4 people on a podcast, 3 guests and myself. And we're going to be talking about something super cool. It's rebranding, why you do it, how you do it, lessons learned, etc. But before we do that, we're going to do a quick round of introductions. And it's going to go name, title, company, and where you're located. Then you pick the next person. I'll start off. I'm Mark Schreider. I'm with memoQ, the Strategic Sales Director. I'm also the co-founder and CEO of memoQ RFP. I'm based in Bellevue, Washington, which is right across the lake from beautiful Seattle, Washington. Jonas, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here. So my name is Jonas Ryberg. I'm the Chief Globalization Officer at Centific. I'm based out of New York.
Awesome.
And I'll hand it over to Robin.
Thank you, Jonas. My name is Robin Ayoub. I'm the General Manager and Vice President of Sales for Lionbridge Canada. At the same time, I am the President of the Canadian Language Industry Association. I am currently located on the highway somewhere between Toronto and Ottawa.
I'm Charles Campbell from TBO. I'm calling in from the wilds of South America, Cordoba, Argentina. I'm originally from New Zealand, and I did a very successful rebrand earlier this year.
All right. Well, thank you. And as I mentioned, you guys all have experience with rebranding, but you've all done it in slightly different contexts. Charles, you've rebranded your own organization, I believe, more than once, but you'll elaborate on that. Jonas, you've been with Centific when they went through the rebranding from Pactera Edge to Centific. And Robin, you've been through a couple of rebrandings through acquisition from Lexitech was acquired by CLS, so you had CLS Lexitech, and then CLS was acquired by Lionbridge, right? So you've been through it, all of you, in kind of different contexts, but similar, and also in the same industry. Let me ask you this. Before we start talking about rebranding, let's do a level set in what your thoughts are in terms of what is a brand and why is it so important? And Robin, I'm going to start with you because you probably work with arguably one of the most recognizable brands in our industry. What is a brand and why is it important?
So a brand is, in my opinion, is name recognition, and the stronger the brand, the shorter the sales cycle. Like I always think about, there is a connection between brand and selling, because ultimately you're in business to sell, and it doesn't matter if you have a brand, you have a banner, or you don't have a banner. Most likely you do. But branding, generally, it's directly connected to how quickly you're going to find a customer, or customer is going to find you. And B is, if the brand is trusted and well recognized in the industry, it will influence how short the sales cycle is from a convincing point of view. And so that's my answer to that question. Yeah,
there's that saying that nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM, right? Because IBM has that trust, right? And it's like, they're credible and so on. Jonas, did you want to add anything to that?
That was a great take from Robin, especially from a client perspective and from a sales perspective, right? So if I look at it from the internal perspective, from the looking at it as an employee or part of a company, it's also something to identify with, something perhaps for the team to rally around. So I think that part is really important as well.
It's interesting. Can you give like a specific example of how you would rally around a brand as an employee? Is that in terms of like, hey, we're working for this leading edge company versus kind of a more traditional entity, or maybe you can drill down on that a bit?
Yeah, it depends on what you associate with the brand, right? So if it is that you want to be seen as a cutting edge brand, you have that identity as a brand, then for sure it's that. If it's more, I want to be part of an organization that is very stable, has a long tradition in the market and so on, then maybe that's the identity of the brand and something that the team can rally around. You fill it with meaning essentially as a company and as employees of that organization.
It's very interesting. And Charles?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in unless you're Google and you have this amazing amount of firepower to get your name known, even if your name means zero, like Google, or these invented names that many Silicon Valley-based companies have. If you're in the real world of the mere mortals, I think a name is helpful if it means something. And there are different ways it can mean something. It can mean something with the names of the founders. That's very common with law firms and accounting firms. Although they tend to have simplified those over time in rebranding processes too, like PwC. But for us, I mean, we were Translation Back Office, which I felt was an amazing name. I was in love with the name and was held back on changing the name for years, despite suggestions from all directions to modernize and simplify and change. But I love the name because it was a concept. We were the back office for the translation industry. And we only made the change when I felt that the name had achieved enough penetration with the industry and that we had moved on conceptually to other things way beyond translation, so that translation back office became outdated, outmoded for us. It was also far too long.
Yeah, it is a bit long. You've kind of already led us into that part about like why rebrand, and so I'm going to continue with you, Charles. So you've invested and you've built this brand over the years, and your customers know you, the employees are familiar with that brand. You started to touch on the reasons for why rebranding. Maybe you can kind of drill down on that and explain your thought processes. It's like, oh, should we do it? Why shouldn't we do it? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, in our case, our customers had already started calling us TBO, and so had our employees, and so had our vendors. And then I basically found out that everybody was calling it TBO except me, because translation back office was just far too long. So it's a little bit like I have 3 names and a surname, right? So my children only have 1 name and 1 surname. We simplified passing on to the next generation. And it was time to simplify and modernize for translation back office. That said, we were able to do it, I felt, because translation back office had achieved a near ubiquitous level of market penetration or familiarity within the translation industry, so that we could then go to TBO and nobody was lost in the transition from translation back office to TBO. Now, if we had rebranded as something totally different, it would have required more work.
What I'm hearing you say is that your customers were already referring to you as TBO. Your employees were already doing that. And at the same time, you were doing more than translation, or you're starting to do more than translation. So you don't really need to have the translation back office, the quote unquote translation in the title there, right? So it was like, it just seemed to kind of naturally, a natural flow of events. And it's like, hey, why not rebrand?
Yeah, also the simplification is not to be underestimated. There's a lot of translation companies that were, companies like, I don't know, there was one company called ISI, and ISI used to be something else. And I meant something, and S meant something, and I meant something. And there's been a whole trend in the last 20 years to move away from long names to shorter names. I don't mean that Coca-Cola has to be calling itself CC, because Coca-Cola is short enough. But in our case, there was also a conceptual meaning, because we'd moved way beyond translation into testing and teaching and training and talent and teams. So there were 6 T's instead of 5, instead of just translation. So instead of saying, teaching, translation, team, whatever, back office, we just made it TBO. Now, for example, Jonas's rebranding is much more ambitious. The name is totally different.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. But before I ask that, it's funny that you brought up Coke, because I did a little research prior to this conversation, and Pepsi over the last 122 years has rebranded 13 times, 13 different logos. Coke has barely touched their logo. And Coke is considered the more traditional organization, and that's part of their brand. Is just like, hey, we're Coca-Cola, and they're very reluctant to touch that. So it's kind of interesting. Jonas, over to you. Yeah, because from translation back office to TBO, there seems to be this kind of natural kind of transition there. But you went from Pactera Edge to Centific. Explain the why on that.
Yeah. couple of reasons, I would say, and maybe we should have done it sooner, to be honest. So we used to be part of Pactera. We did a spin-off from Pactera almost 4 years ago now, but we didn't rebrand until early this year. So we existed as Pactera Edge and Pactera next to each other, being completely separate companies, separate, not two entities of the same mother organization, but completely separate companies. So by the start of this year, we came to that point. We can't postpone this any longer. We have to pull the trigger and go through that rebranding. And the reason was essentially because the industry was confused. We were two companies with very similar names, just the addition of the edge in our case, and we were delivering the same type of services and capabilities to the market. And in some cases, we had even the same clients, or at least trying to penetrate the same clients. So we got questions from some of those clients and prospects that we reached out to. Well, aren't we really already working with you guys? We're working with Pactera and so on. So it just became a necessity. We had to go through that process. And actually, we started much sooner than obviously early this year. It was a long process from the decision to do a rebranding to the point when we announced Centific as the name of the company in January of this year.
It's interesting, and it shows how little I know, but I actually thought that you guys were like sister organizations or subsidiaries and everything like that. So if I was confused, I'm sure, I wasn't the only one. And so it totally makes a lot of sense, even though Pactera itself sounds really cool. It's a cool name, as is Centific, but it makes sense for the rationale there. Now, Robin, you went through this rebranding as part of acquisitions, and maybe you can just talk about the Lexitech acquisition and then the CLS acquisition, and how do you determine, because you went for a hybrid at first, and then eventually you moved it all over. Talk a little bit about that.
So I have 3 rebranding experiences. The first one has to do with the acquisitions that you mentioned. And the third one, when 2 years ago, we rebranded the association from ALIA to the Canadian Language Industry Association. So I heard, Charles, we're going from large names to small abbreviation of names. And this is the case where we went from small abbreviation of names to a large descriptive name. And I'll talk about that in a second. So let's address the first one. From Lexitech International, that was the original name, got bought by CLS Communication. That's a second company now that became one company. In Europe was always CLS Communication. The discussions were around what do we do with the brand in North America. This is where we said, okay, well, let's contemplate a little bit. And it goes back to every time you contemplate rebranding, that's one of the items I always look at is what is the value of the current brand and what can we salvage out of that so we can retain that value and don't throw the baby on the bathwater kind of thing. So normally what companies tend to do, in a normal acquisition, and we'll talk about that in a second, is they buy the company, you become ours, you fly our banner. That's one model. The second model would say, no, you continue operating the way you're operating and don't change anything. And the third model is, somewhere in between, which what happened with CLS Lexitech. So this is where Lexitech International in North America had a lot of name recognition. People knew who the company was. And you've got a buying company coming to North America with less known name. At that time, CLS Communication was not well known in North America. So we created that hybrid name to allow for a little bit more name recognition for CLS in North America, and also to retain the already value in the Lexitech name, Lexitech brand in North America. So that's one thing. The second second acquisition went through when CLS Lexitech or CLS Communication got bought by Lionbridge. That was complete full sort of amalgamation, and we had to go through the process of rebranding. And both of them, the first rebrand that we talked about and this second rebrand that we talked about, as Jonas mentioned earlier, there's 2 things that we need to worry about. We need to worry about how the customer perceives the rebranding. Are they on board? In the case of Charles, his customers knew about the rebrand before he did. So in our case, we're basically telling the customer or telling the market or the internal team, here's the new brand. Basically, here's the new flag that we're going to be flying. So there is a bit of a communication management strategy that you need to take with your customer to position this as a positive, and that goes. And I did a lot of conversations on this on my podcast with people who did this. Basically, this is part of the I want to call it the amalgamation strategy. You bought a company, then what? Basically, are you going to be merging them all together? Are you going to take what's good from one company and what's good from the other and leave them the way they are? Are you going to fine tune? And the rebranding is an integral part when buying a company or branding the brand that you're buying into or buying, etc. So this needs to be evaluated in a variety of ways. And the third one I want to talk about is rebranding the Canadian Language Association. So we used to be called AILIA, AILLIA. And it was, every time I talk to somebody about AILIA, people tell me, who is AILIA? And I have to go through, a conversation just to explain who AILIA was. So I said, okay, enough with that. And when I was elected president, I said, first thing on the agenda, rebrand. We're going to rebrand to a name that people recognize what that is. What do we do? When I say, when I tell you what the name is, you automatically going to think, okay, I know what these guys do for a living. So we created the Canadian Language Industry Association. And we are doing this in phases. So the first phase we're going to do is Canadian Language Association, the entire name. And the second phase down the road will be called CLIA. In fact, right now we have CLIA as a sort of in parentheses, so everybody knows what CLIA is. But we're keeping the longer version of the name out there just to make sure that everybody's being educated on what does this association do for a living. So I threw a lot of information out there, and every one of them can be dived into quite deep. But I'll just leave it at this for now.
No, that's awesome. And each one of you gave very legitimate reasons. In fact, Robin gave two for rebranding. And if I come back to the acquisition thing for a second, it's funny because whenever there's an acquisition going to happen, you get all this anxiety and questions that come from your customers, from your internal audience, and from the company that's being acquired. And part of that question anxiety is, well, how's this going to work, and how are we going to be rebranded, how we're going to work together? And Robin, you've been there 2 times, and then you bring up the Canadian Language Industry Association. It's funny because I'm on the steering committee for the Seattle Localization Users Group, which we call SLUG, and we went through a rebranding. And my co-steering committee member, Rick Antezana from Dynamic Language, he actually went out and commissioned a SLUG logo, and it's awesome. So hats off to Rick for doing that. But that's really important for these associations, right? I mean, because the associations need identity too. Jonas, let me come back to you now, because, okay, we've all agreed that these are, important reasons for rebranding. How do you do it? What are the first steps? Do you reach out to consultants? Do you just, explain the whole process? And I know that we only have another half hour. Yeah,
at least 90 minutes, just that, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what we realized too, that it's really an iceberg, right? It seems like there's this initiative that you can do. You pick a name, you design a logo, and then you're more or less done. But there's so much to it. And like I mentioned previously, it took us a long time from the decision to actually rebrand to launch Centific as a brand. I would say a year or so to do that. And that is with a department within the company that is specialized on these things, not just the marketing department, but essentially a digital agency department within the company that offers this type of services to our clients. So I think what we learned through that process for Centific was that you cannot do this by committee. You want people to agree with the name and like the name, but there's so many opinions when you do that. So we had to decide to keep it to a fairly tight group that had that as the initiative, and they were working on it. They were sharing updates to the leadership team, but we didn't go through we weren't very Swedish in the way that we weren't trying to get consensus all along the way through that process. So I guess trying to get into a little bit of detail on that, we started with trying to capture the attributes that we want to communicate. What do we want to convey with the brand? Is it descriptive, or is it more trying to generate a feeling, or like what we talked about, is it more a traditional name, or is it more sort of trying to communicate being at the forefront of technology, and so on. So we went through a bit of I think it was a survey process at the time with the leadership team to capture 3 to 5 attributes and a few values. And then from that, we generated a long list of suggestions. I think we had about 100 suggestions on that first list, and then just started going through that, where some had to be dropped from the list because there was someone else in the industry with a similar name. There were some legal considerations, so we couldn't go with a name for whatever reason. And then, of course, there's a lot of steps that you have to go through, especially in our industry, when it comes to how does this name work in Spain or in China or in the US. So we had to go through that process. And then we had, of course, some people had a veto and so on. So we eventually got to a point where we maybe had 10 names or so. And at that point, then we went through more proper voting and made sure to go through a full discovery and vetting process of those names.
That doesn't sound painful at all. No, I can just imagine. I mean, because you mentioned some are just like hard stops. Like somebody else has the name, somebody else has the domain, and they're not selling it. Nova in Spanish means no go, so we can't use that. So those are hard stops. But then you have just opinions that you have to deal with, and who. So I can imagine some of those kind of conversations. Charles, you come up from maybe a bit smaller organization. And I don't know what your internal decision making process is like. But did you do an internal consensus building, or did you work with an external consultant, or a mix of both? How did you deal with it?
The main obstacle to getting this process underway was convincing me, because it was a down-up process. My team came up with the idea, and I was holding off. And I'm the sole owner of the company, so when the sole owner of the company is not really keen, it's hard to move forward. But they totally convinced me. They did a very interesting presentation and explained it, and I trusted them and went with it, and then felt an enormous amount of relief, and it was a wonderful experience. It modernized us, simplified us, also got everyone very energized and engaged. As I said, it was a down-up process, which I thought everyone found very invigorating. But we're not a large company as compared to Lionbridge or Centific, so there were fewer people involved. But nevertheless, it was a team effort, and there was 2 people from marketing and a graphic designer, someone from sales, someone from operations, and someone from admin involved. And really, it worked out really well for us, and it totally energized the whole company. Our customers loved the change. The employees definitely loved the change. Shorter emails, shorter messages, and also it totally prepared us to spread the word about the other services we offer beyond translation in terms of talent and testing and teams and teaching and so forth. That the name translation back office was obviously limiting us with. When we did the rebrand at Juntos, it was even easier, because Juntos, which is the association that represents translation, localization, and interpreting companies in Latin America and the Caribbean, had an unpronounceable name that was also very similar to other associations' names. It was the Association of Language Companies of Latin America and the Caribbean. We didn't even know what we were called. We were ALCALS or ALS-ALC. A little bit like Robin saying he was ALIA, but a lot of people pronounce the European Language Industry Association as ALIA. Of course, if you're a Spanish speaker, you say ALIA, but for a lot of English speakers, the European Association was ALIA, and then the association in Canada that Robin represents was also ALIA. I would literally say ALIA, but from Canada. So having a new name can also, avoid confusion, like Jonas was saying about Pactera and Pactera Edge. I thought they were sister companies. I didn't understand the difference. So there you go. With Juntos, going back to the idea of a conceptual name, like translation back office is a conceptual name, as opposed to Google, which just sounds funny and cool and is impossible to forget. Juntos means together in Spanish, and it's pronounced differently in Portuguese. It's juntos, but the meaning is the same and the spelling is the same, together, which I thought was an absolutely amazing name for an association, a new association, the new kid on the block when it comes to associations, together. It was also cool that we could get a name that meant the same thing, was spelled the same way in Spanish and Portuguese, given that we represent Latin America and the Caribbean. It was great. We came up with it after several hours of brainstorming and an amazing lunch in Peru. So
I think there was some wine involved, if I remember the story correctly. But yes, great inspirational lubricant there. By the way, I love your new logo, the TBO logo. Was that designed in-house, or did you use an external agency, or how did you do that? Did
there
you
was a lot of talk about the logo, and they got stuck on things like whether or not there should be a dot after the O. And those small details actually proved to be very exciting. The devil was in the detail. It was an in-house design, and then we worked with an external marketing agency to validate our concepts. And when we redid our website, we definitely had to involve an external marketing agency. There was lots of ideas being floated around, so that was what we came up with.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Let's jump forward here now, because you've all been through the process. And again, we could probably spend a half a day, if not longer, talking about this, but we're under some kind of time constraints here. Let's start with Robin. And what were the biggest lessons learned in terms of, hey, this really worked well, and God, if we could go back and redo this, we would do this differently?
The main thing for me from lesson learned is communicate. This is not I rebranded and so the world has to accept it. No, there's an element of selling it internally and externally. And you can sometimes feel like you're over communicating. And I tell you, it is, and up till today, just to give you an example, the rebrand has happened a long time ago. I want to say more than 10 years ago for Lionbridge, for instance. I still have people calling me Lexi, meaning Lexitech. And, these are the old customers that have been with us for many years. So that, even though the memo has been passed and everybody knows who we are, it's hard to break a habit sometimes. So I'd say communicate. And sometimes it feels like over communicating. It's okay. Continue communicating the new brand to people, because let's face it, you mentioned two brands initially in this conversation. Unfortunately, none of the translation company, I don't care how big they are, they're not PepsiCo from a brand perspective, and they're not Coca-Cola from the brand perspective, right? So there is a lot of value for those brands. And in order for any one of us in the localization firms to retain or to obtain the same value as a large brands like IBM, like PepsiCo or Coca-Cola, that's billions of dollars. And I don't know if any one translation company or localization company is there. Maybe there is, I don't know, but we're far away from that. On our scale, basically, from an industry perspective, from where we are, we need to make sure that we are, creating the value for the brand, and that each brand has its own value, and that value will be retained over years. Like, you have to accumulate it over the years by, doing a great job, rebranding for a good reason, and making sure the rebrand is refreshing the entire company. So not just like and I like what Charles did with TBO. He rebranded and introduced simultaneously. It's like, although he's been offering for many years, but he rebranded the services that he's offering with this brand. So it's not just we changed the logo, we changed the name. Now I've got an offering. I've got something new I want to tell you about.
It makes a lot of sense, and I think that's great advice. Is communicate, and when you think you're done, communicate some more. Jonas, what worked, and then also, don't be shy to tell us what didn't work if there were any miscues.
Yeah, no, but first of all, I totally agree with the communication sentiment, right? For sure, and we were still getting questions around Centific and how we relate to Bactera Edge and so on. Clients that actually like Bactera Edge that had built a brand within the organization with some of our bigger clients where they have to communicate on their side as well. If you think about procurement, for example, have to be our advocates within those organizations to explain that this is the company formerly known as Pactera Edge, which was actually a thing that we put on the website for some time as well to help that communication. So that's maybe one practical lesson that we learned, that make sure that you communicate even on your website after the fact by referring to your previous brand. I think the other thing that I would take or suggest as an advice is that it starts with that process that I mentioned, that whatever there was, like 7-8 months of just discussing different names. But then you have to start looking at this as a critical program or project initiative for the entire company to pull off successfully, right? It's not just about the name and the logo. You have to involve IT, of course. You have to change servers, and you have to involve legal for obvious reasons. And that's a big undertaking in itself. Marketing, of course, all the updates to websites, but all the collateral as well. So pre-sales in that sense. And of course, sales, communication to clients. So I think that was the biggest lesson, that treat this as a project. We didn't expect it to be as to require as much time as it did, as long as it did, but also as many people as it did across the entire company to make this successful. And it's still to some extent an ongoing effort, even though we've more or less landed it now, 10 months later.
Excellent. Great observations. And I like that suggestion or recommendation of obviously mapping this all out as a project. You probably have a massive Gantt chart with all the different stakeholders that you need to involve. It just seems super complex. Charles, any lessons learned or advice you'd like to pass on?
For Juntos, it was an easy process because we were a young organization. So definitely, I think if you're a young organization, you're a new organization, you're a smaller organization, it's going to be easier. So the earlier you do it, the better. For TBO, I think we could have done it a year earlier if I had, gotten, utilized the free time that the pandemic created to a certain degree. Maybe we could have done it a year earlier. But it really worked out as an unleashing of creativity and communication, as Robin said, communicate. And I'm not sure I have any lessons learned at this point, because we're still tweaking our website. We're still doing a few little things. But for us, it was a very easy transition because it was a little like home box office becoming HBO. It was a shortening of the name. And people found it very easy to understand and digest that change. And as we've all said, it conceptually fit into the change in business model as well. So really, I was thrilled. I've always thought a name shouldn't be limiting. Like some of my competitors have names where it's the owner's name is the name of the company. What happens if the owner sells the company? And of course, if the owner's personal brand is damaged for some reason, I don't know, whatever, then that damages the company very heavily and very directly.
It happens.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Won't go there. You know what I mean?
I mean, we've had presidents who have in our country we've had presidents who've had amazing brands, and then they became president, and then how does that all work out? And it can be complicated, right?
Exactly. So I think that the school of thought of using your owner's name as a brand, I think is a bad idea. Personally, I think it's also something that came from 20, 30, or 40 years ago. And I also think that long names are out and shorter names are in. And there's dozens and dozens of examples of that, of the major accounting firms shortening their names to just initials. Law firms, suddenly they had like 5 different partners' names, and 2 of the partners' names are gone. I mean, Deloitte, Touche, Tumatsu, I mean, it's like now it's just Deloitte. What happened to the other guys? They're probably still there. They're probably still owners, but it was just, shortening process. So, these changes are not exempt from pitfalls and risks. But I think in the case of Lexitech and Pactera Edge and in translation back office, they seem to have been very successful changes. I even heard that there was another company called Lexitech in Europe that was not connected to the Canadian Lexitech. And there are a couple of examples out there in this industry when there's I think there's two translation companies called Arcadia, one in Argentina and one in Italy, for example. I mean, that's a strange coincidence, and there's no way to sort that out. Maybe the best way is just for one of them to rebrand spontaneously and energize. I don't know.
Let me ask you, how do you measure success? Do you do that? Is it an exercise like a year on, 2 years on? Do you look at do you do a brand study in the market, brand recognition study? Do you do an internal survey? I mean, anything like that? Jonas?
It's a good idea. I like it. We should do that now, maybe in January, 12 months after the rebrand. We haven't done that. So I guess we're looking at actually brand awareness as a KPI. So for sure, it's something that we should look at. But just to go back to what Charles was saying, I really agree with the trend. TBO is certainly on trend with going with a short name. Look at Twitter and X, or I think HBO Max is now Max only, something like that, or at least it was being considered. And we're also we've been going through this process of branding again recently. We're launching a platform related to LLMs probably before the end of the year, potentially in January. And we're looking at a very short name of just 4 letters, not really a name as such. So basically an acronym. So definitely on trend and on point with TBO.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you brought it up. So Twitter to X, good move or not?
I think it was meant to be somehow. I know X has been on Elon Musk's mind for, 20 years or 25 years or whatever it is, right? So I think it was unavoidable. It hasn't really grown on me yet, but I think that's another point when it comes to rebranding, that most names just seem wrong at first, unless it's something that feels quite natural as translation back office to TBO. That makes perfect sense, right? But for us, when we changed from Pactera Edge to Centific, like you said, it was a completely different name. And it didn't really have meaning at first. Of course, there's a story or a logic behind it, but you fill it with meaning. So at first, it sort of feels, what does it even mean? Why would we be called Centific? But after 1 or 2 weeks, it already started sort of filling it with meaning. So I think it might be the same eventually with X as well, that it just becomes natural. But I'm still sort of cringing a little bit when you see Twitter or the bird or something on TV when people refer to that platform. So it hasn't quite worked out yet, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a massive brand, and so I agree with you. It will take time. And it's interesting because I think we all view it from different angles. Maybe because I'm here in the Pacific Northwest and I go to so many events where Centific has a big presence. And actually, the Slug event that we had most recently, we had a panel discussion on LLMs, was sponsored by Centific. And so, like, in my mind, Pactera Edge it's not even there anymore. It's Centific. And I think being close to the kind of, the mothership probably affects me to that. There's more of a kind of gravitational pull towards the new brand. So I think that's important. Let me ask kind of a last question, because I know, Charles, you're running short on time here. We've talked about corporate rebranding and corporate branding. How important do you think it is for yourselves? And why don't you give some advice to people who are coming up in the industry as well to have a personal brand?
That's a very good question. Very, very good question.
Charles?
If you look at some of the larger companies out there, their social media presence is often a bit diminished, especially with LinkedIn. Like the big companies in the translation, localization, and interpreting industry tend to be much less active on social media than the smaller and medium-sized companies. And sometimes you'll have like a press release from one of the larger companies, which is quite impersonal and it makes it more difficult to connect. But then you might have the CEO of a very large company saying, I already work 55 hours a week. Where am I supposed to find this time to be talking on social media? So I can understand that. But sometimes there's a whole department producing impersonal communication that people don't connect with. I've also said that if your brand is overly associated with the founder or the owner, and that person has some kind of nosedive in terms of their ethics, whatever, then you can get into trouble. There's been cases in Silicon Valley where they've sort of jettisoned the CEO, who was this charismatic founder, because he or she, mostly he, got into trouble in some way or another. And it's affected stock price and company morale and so forth. But I do think that when people are looking at social media, and in particular LinkedIn, which is the media I use the most, obviously as well, Instagram, people don't want to read the sort of press release format. It's perceived as boring or like oatmeal. I think that the personal connection is more valuable. It doesn't mean that you have to be posting about what you had for lunch. Bad idea. Still has to have meaning and be meaningful and thoughtful and make you a go-to person for whatever it is you're talking about. But there are people also who have a strong personal brand and struggle to monetize it. So, I don't think a strong personal brand is in any way a replacement for a strong cash flow. But I do think that a strong brand and strong company brand and strong personal brand can help get the word out for small, medium, and large sized companies. Problem with the personal brand, if you're a corporate, is that people change jobs. So, let's say I'm ambassador for such and such an important company, and I build up a brand. And whose brand am I building up? My brand or the company's brand or this synergy of our brands? And what happens if I change organizations, So these are things to think about. But I definitely think that having no voice at all is definitely the wrong road.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you're saying there. Jonas, what are your thoughts on developing a personal brand?
I would agree with Charles. Definitely, you should not be quiet. I think it's not helpful, of course. So definitely for people coming up, it makes sense to try to build a personal brand. I think also it's rewarding in the sense that it's not only building your brand, but you're also learning while you do it. Because again, I agree with Charles. It needs to have substance, right? It's not about just updating social media and get anything out there. It's about putting content out there that actually has some substance to it. So as you do that, as you produce those pieces, whether it's a blog article or a podcast, then you learn as you do it as well. So you accelerate your career in that sense too. So I would certainly advise people to work on their personal brand and add substance while they do that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because to Charles' point that a lot of the larger companies seem to be posting kind of dry material and the people who work there are not so active on social media. What I found is a lot of the large companies are very, very protective of their brand. And so they have a lot of restrictions in terms of what the people who work there can do on social media. And you may even have to get any kind of post pre-approved. If you're posting as an employee of this organization or on behalf of the organization, it has to go through an approval process, and it can be quite challenging sometimes to get the go-ahead to do that. Smaller organizations tend to be a bit more nimble. They tend to be a little bit more, shoot from the hip and just, hey, let's go, and that encourages. And then you kind of create this, in the best case scenario where individuals have their personal brand, but that ties in nicely with the company brand. In our company, we have, I wouldn't call them brand ambassadors, but they essentially are. I mean, people that I work with, like Alessio and Mugais, Santiago, these people, they travel around the world. They go to all these events. People know them and like them, and then they post things relevant to the events or things that they're learning. And it all kind of ties into the memoQ kind of community. So it all kind of works together. Now, do people ever cross the line and maybe post things that kind of run contrary to the brand that we're trying to convey as a company? I guess it happens. And then, and then you have to deal with it. But it's this kind of balance. I think the other thing that you said, that both of you said this, is whatever you post, it should be authentic. It shouldn't be just like, oh, here's what I ate for lunch, or here is my press release. Do something that's authentic.
I was listening to what Charles was describing it. It has to work both ways, and it only works. Personal brand is very important. Especially if all employees collectively pull together to support an organization. Imagine the power of social media or however you want to measure this. Imagine the power where if you have like 100 employees working for you, regular size company in our industry, and they're all pulling together positively forward, regardless of your branding or you're not rebranding for that organization, using their own, how small it is, their own personal network to drive that company forward. And in whatever method, as long as they're positively speaking about the organization, basically they're spreading the word out about the organization. Personal brand, in my opinion, is the center focus for everything has to do with branding. Of course, when you carry a business card that well recognized for a brand that is well recognized, it makes life a lot easier. But if you are going through a rebrand and you have a well-connected workforce and they have their own personal brands on the go, it makes life a lot easier. Now they're going to push that for you. In fact, I know a lot of companies, not in our industry, and I heard somebody was mentioning earlier, you need to vet what they're doing. There are companies out there that they facilitate, even in our company, we facilitate for people to share things that the company is putting it out there. And we all need to do that, because now you are using that amplification method, if you will, of the messaging. You're amplifying the brand. There is a risk, obviously, as everybody would understand that. There is a risk somebody leaves, etc. But that comes with the territory. I mean, there is a risk if they leave or they don't leave. If they're doing a bad job, it's a risk. If they leave and they take, let's say, they're not doing anything in the personal branding perspective, if a salesperson leaves you, that's a risk. There's a risk in life, but you take it as it goes and you manage it as it goes.
I think some great advice, and out of all of us, I mean, I think you have an amazingly strong personal brand, and part of it's related to your position. You've been in a similar type of role with ever-increasing larger organizations, and then also is your role as president of the Canadian Language Association. I probably got that wrong, but you know what I'm saying. But you seem to have a kind of a consistent brand that you've been developing throughout the years. So. Well, gentlemen, I gotta say, I mean, we're running up on our time here. I've enjoyed the conversation, and unfortunately, we don't have more time, because literally we could go on for hours. Even one of those topics that we touched on, we could go down deeper rabbit holes. But let me ask you, any last comments or thoughts or advice that you'd like to share with people in the localization or outside in terms of rebranding?
In my case, as I said, I think I've made it very clear that for us, it was a really energizing process. There was a lot of energy unleashed. As I said, it was a down-up process, so we also got people from different parts of the organization getting to tell me, as the owner and founder, what they thought was best. It was ganged up on, and it really worked. It was great. And we shortened, modernized, rejuvenated, we feel younger, feel clearer. And since we did a business model change in the same process, we got two for the price of one in terms of the pain involved with change. And the pain involved with change was far outweighed by the benefit in terms of confusing and so forth, which I'm sure Jonas would agree with that, with Bacteria Edge, and so forth. So I would say, yeah, if you don't do a rebrand just because you want to rebrand. I mean, there has to be a reason. Don't throw a good brand out the window. Certainly took some convincing. In my case, the translation back office was ready to retire, and TBO was ready to take over. But I got unanimously positive feedback from our customers, our employees, our network, followers, very unanimous, and a lot of congratulatory messages, and also some suggestions too, like isn't TBO like HBO? I mean, that kind of thing, which is cool. We got our clients involved. We asked them for their opinions, which I thought was cool too. I guess that's something you could do when you're a smaller company, and if you're a larger company, you couldn't really ask your clients what they thought. But for us, we did. We reached out to our clients and said, what do you think of this change? And got a lot of very interesting feedback. So I would, I'm not saying I'm going to do it all over again, because I think we're going to be TBO for a long, long time. But I wouldn't hold back. And if you feel that something around the office is getting old and dusty, then maybe it's your name.
Great observations and advice there. And I got to say, one thing that I like about your process of doing this is that, we spoke about a year ago, and you said that you typically don't go and exhibit at events, but I saw you at a couple of events very recently, most recently at the local in Silicon Valley, and it was great to see the CEO there with the TBO hat on, with the TBO booth. And I think that just reinforced the brand and the fact that you're offering all these other services, because, this is just anecdotal, but I heard a lot about TBO talent, a lot. And so not just from you, I'm talking about from a lot of people who are talking and say, hey, he's onto something here, some really cool stuff. Jonas, any closing thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I would agree. Don't take it lightly. It is a lot of work. There's a lot of effort in going through a rebrand, but it can definitely be very rewarding as well. I think for us, it was always necessary for the reasons I mentioned, but it has also been a great experience of creating that energy. It's a new identity, and it's almost like a new company in a sense. And we changed a lot as an organization over the years before the rebrand. So we took that as an opportunity to celebrate that as well. So we had town halls, we had local get-togethers, celebrations, we had branded employee gifts, and so on, to really create excitement around it and fill that brand with meaning as well. So I wouldn't advise anyone not to do it, but just consider that it takes a lot of effort as well.
And I think you guys have done an amazing job too of being present at events and doing, large gatherings, etc. I participated in an event when you guys were at Local, and you rented out part of the Levi Stadium, the VIP booth, and you guys are really, active in the community, and I think that helps as well.
The only thing I would say is, think hard about why are you doing it and what's in it for you as a company, not as an individual, as a company. When you rebrand, why are you rebranding? And do you have enough reasons to rebrand? And for businesses, you're not doing it just because the logo looks beautiful. You're not doing it because I'm going to have to buy a whole bunch of brand new collateral material. I'm sick and tired of the old ones. And that's not what you're doing it. For business, you're doing it for a single reason only. How much revenue that's going to cause you, and how many customers going to bring you. And anything else is, plus and bonuses. But you got to think, why am I doing this as a business? How much revenue that's going to produce for me? How many customers are going to produce for me? How many client retention, or how many new employees, if I'm in the resourcing business, it's going to bring me, because the name is attractive, is going to get the first conversations on the go. The rest of the items around, picking the right logo, and there's experts for those. People can help you through those. The strategy, there's a lot of people can help you with the strategy on that stuff. But the main fundamental thing, it has to be a strategic decision. Why are we doing this? And it has to be convincing why you're doing it.
Well, gentlemen, I've enjoyed the conversation. Wish we had more time. But, you guys have an amazing amount of experience here. I'm sure that anybody that who listens to this or views this podcast that has any questions, I would encourage them to reach out to you for, advice, thoughts, etc. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on memoQ Talks.
Thank you for joining memoQ Talks, where we talked with industry leaders about their experiences and lessons learned to gain new insights about what works best across all areas of localization. Join us next time on memoQ Talks.